Howdy doody everyone, and welcome back to my journey across the United States. Remember, I told you we were going somewhere toasty for the winter, and our first stop in these warmer states is Florida. Now, I'll let you in on a little secret about me. Right after college, I actually lived in Florida for a little while, in Jacksonville. And while some I know are drawn to Florida's beaches, I've always found myself more inclined to wander through your swamps and nature preserves. And as it turns out, you've got some weird stuff in there. Balls that move around on their own, and creatures that watch you back when you stumble upon them. Anyways, on this trip to Florida, I only ask for one thing to pay for your ticket: a like, a subscription, and a comment. But only if you decide you're enjoying the video. Otherwise, these videos will always be completely free. Anyways, thanks for stopping by, and let's get into the video. The Betz family lived on Fort George Island, an island that's technically part of Jacksonville, Florida, but is in actuality about 14 miles to the northeast of downtown Jacksonville. The father, Antoine, was an engineer, and Jerry was an artist, and the family had 6 children. This family lived in a mansion in Fort George they lovingly referred to as the Castle, and as you might expect from a family that lived in a mansion named the Castle, the family was very well-to-do and well-educated. Now, one day there was a brush fire on their property, and the family went out to assess the damage caused by it, and this is when the family supposedly stumbled upon a large polished metal sphere, about 8 inches or 20 centimeters in diameter, that was extremely heavy for its size, weighing about 22 pounds. They would actually bring this sphere home and inspect it, finding on it that there were no signs of machining, so to speak. And beyond a couple of small scratches, the only visible markings on it were a triangle of sorts. This ball would be set on one of the children's windowsills in the home at first, as the family thought it was a cannonball left behind by conquistadors that once resided in the region. And for a while, the family would think nothing of this polished metal ball. That is until Terry, the child that brought it home, would notice strange noises coming from the ball while he was playing a guitar with one of his friends in his room. This noise would apparently intensify as he played the guitar closer to the ball. He would then, after inspecting it a bit, set the ball on the ground. And according to Terry, though nobody was around the ball, it would suddenly start moving on its own. We'll talk a bit more about this part later. Regardless, the claim was that the ball would alternate between rolling around, vibrating, and rolling more in another direction, sometimes even coming back to the person who rolled it, and one account even claimed that it rolled on its own for 12 minutes at one point. Heck, they even put the ball on a table once and tried to get it to roll off, and it wouldn't. They would literally turn the table on its side, and the ball would remain on the table, as if clinging on for dear life. They also claimed that if you shook the ball, it would sort of try to get away from you. It also was apparently magnetic, and according to the family, when it rolled more or was exposed to the sun, it would become more magnetic, and even absorb sunlight and remain warm for days afterwards. Anyways, all of this would prompt a photographer, Lon Anger, to come pay a visit to the so-called oddball, or the Betz Sphere as they called it, whatever you want to call it. Now, the claim was that this photographer was skeptical, and sure enough, despite this skepticism, he would observe the ball doing its weird stuff, rolling and changing direction mostly, and then coming back to him again after it rolled around. At this point, he would publish a story in the newspaper about this strange ball, and this would ignite a media frenzy surrounding it. According to the Betz family, they were getting calls non-stop at this point from the media, and this was probably pretty annoying, but inevitably this grew out of its britches even more, and the US military became interested in this strange metal sphere. Jerry Betz strangely would decline to give this so-called oddball to the military representatives that reached out to the family. But as we know well, when the military asks you for something, it's actually more of a demand, and further pressure would prompt the family to loan it to them for 2 weeks. To be clear, this further pressure was the Navy saying, hey, this sphere you've got may literally be an undetonated explosive, which is, sort of fair to be clear. You don't want to let explosives chill in your home. Anyways, the Navy even signed a contract saying that they'd identify the orb for the family and return it if it wasn't an explosive device. Sounds reasonable enough to me. Ultimately, the Navy would report the following details about the sphere, which I think the family mostly already knew. It was, as we've stated, about 8 inches in diameter. It was just over 21 pounds in weight. It was made of a magnetic stainless steel alloy, and it was extremely resilient to heat and pressure. It was stainless steel grade 431. It had 4 magnetic poles that were strangely variable, and they also X-rayed the sphere, and they weren't able to determine anything about it, thus returning it to the Betz family since it didn't appear dangerous. This being said, things started to not line up at this point. When a Navy serviceman returned the object to the Betz family, he had X-rays of it in hand, despite the Navy initially claiming they couldn't X-ray it. These X-rays claimed there was something inside of the sphere. The shell was about a half-inch thick, but inside of the sphere there were more layers of steel, and there was also a hollow space inside of it, where there were smaller spheres with apparent wires connected to them. These spheres, it's worth noting again, were not placed inside of the bigger sphere later, or at least there wasn't any evidence that they'd been cut into the larger sphere. Of course, all of this strangeness prompted speculation about what this object might be, and the most common explanation by the media and non-military affiliated individuals was that this thing seemed off, like not from our planet off. Further inquiry into the sphere yielded more interesting information about it. For instance, a scientist, one Dr. Williston, found that it was emitting radio waves, but also supposedly identified an undiscovered element was partially comprising the sphere. It's worth noting any digging into who this Dr. Williston was, or what his organization, the Omega-1 Institute, actually did, yields no information. Many take this and speculate that he was perhaps a foreign operative or a deep state scientist, but I wonder if he ever existed at all. Additionally, one Dr. James Harder would investigate this object. Dr. Harder was an engineering professor, and would confirm what Dr. Williston suggested, that a previously unidentified element with 140 protons, yes, our modern periodic table only goes up to elements with 118 protons, partially comprised the sphere. Now I should note, I'm extremely skeptical of this claim of element 140 partially comprising this object, as it's really well known that at the very least, in the conditions we face here on Earth, protons with many neutrons face strong electrostatic repulsion in their nucleus, leading them to become unstable and rapidly decaying. To put this simpler, protons are positive. You know how when you put 2 positive magnet terminals near one another, they will resist being close together, even pushing one another away. Yeah, this is the exact reason it's difficult to sustain elements naturally with many protons, and why the highest amount of protons you'll find naturally on Earth is in uranium, which is element number 92, indicating it has 92 protons in its nucleus. Of course, now that we're talking about hoopty-doopty stuff, we might as well bring Dr. Hynek into this. Hynek was an astronomer and professor, and we actually mentioned him in my Kentucky's Weird Lore video Volume 2 a few weeks ago, where he posited that Mantell, an Air Force pilot, may have been chasing Venus in the sky. Hynek, as you'll recall if you watched that video, was involved in Project Blue Book, a top-secret UFO identification program the government ran from 1952 to 1969, and might still be running now if you believe the urban legends. Regardless, among all of this science, not science, hoodoo-voodoo stuff going on, another cohort of scientists would offer the family about $750,000 for the sphere. They would turn down this offer, though. Now, here comes the climax to this situation. The National Enquirer, yes, I know it's sort of a hose job of a media organization, was offering a cash prize to folks that could prove extraterrestrials existed. And Hynek was on the panel overseeing this so-called proof alongside many other, likely more credible individuals. The Betz family would share the sphere with the National Enquirer because of this. Of course, when the sphere visited this panel of experts, it did what it always did. It rolled around of its own free will. But that's when Terry, the one that accompanied the sphere to this so-called panel of experts at the National Enquirer, got a call. His mother, it seemed, had been in some sort of accident, and he flew home. Of course, his mom was okay, and at this point it was clear what happened. The Enquirer wanted Terry away from his precious sphere, and that short separation was long enough that the panel of experts could bring it to New Orleans for further testing under the guidance of the Navy. Eventually, the Navy would give the sphere back, but the thing is, after their testing, the sphere would no longer do its thing. It stopped rolling around of its own accord. Additionally, it didn't have magnetic poles anymore, and it had a small cut on it. X-rays also showed that there was nothing inside of it anymore. In short, if you don't catch my drift already, it sounds like someone switched out the real deal orb with a fake that they either crafted or the real deal which they'd cut into and hollowed out and taken the valuable stuff out of. So with this story in the backs of our minds, let's answer the riveting question: what do folks think the Betz Sphere might be? One culprit is folks who think it might be a Foo Fighter. No, not the Seattle-based rock band, like the original Foo Fighters. Maybe this is some fun etymology for y'all, but Allied aircraft pilots in World War II saw lots of UFOs, and eventually one of these was named a Foo Fighter by the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, with the word Foo sort of just being a nonsense word. These things would move at speeds unobtainable by craft at that time, and they were frequently reported looking like balls of fire that would follow contemporary aircraft easily. In the Pacific theater of war, for instance, these balls of fire would sort of linger in the sky according to pilots. Others, of course, think this sphere was something more simple, a human-made stainless steel sphere that was polished by industrial equipment, and that all of the fantastical stories about the sphere were made up. An artist from New Mexico, James Durling Jones, claimed the sphere had actually been his, and the sphere's purpose was simply a ball check valve in a pipe, and that he'd lost it off the top of his car at one point. It's worth noting, balls like this, albeit usually smaller ones, are frequently used in industrial applications. They do have seams though, and they do not move of their own accord. Also, rolling into the woods from atop a car is one thing, but the sphere was deep, really deep, like a mile into the woods about. Despite this, this is the Navy's official explanation as of 1974. That this is a huge ball bearing used as a check valve, and that it was probably used in some chemical plants in the area. Heck, even a similar sized and shaped ball was found in the exact same area and reported on by the Miami Herald, who identified it as part of a valve used in a paper mill in the area. To dig deeper, even the prevailing opinion by the National Enquirer scientists was that it was simply a stainless steel ball manufactured right here on Earth. Perhaps to put a further nail in this coffin, a company, Bell & Howell, produced a ball check valve with pretty much identical size, weight, and composition as this sphere, excluding the proton number 140 thing we went through, which refutes the claim that this alien sphere was too large to be a ball check valve. You know, while we're at what people think this sphere is, we should also discuss what people think was fake about the story. Generally, most of the reasonable explanations people bring up regarding the sphere get the response, yeah, but then why did the sphere move on its own? And the answer to this question is that many don't think it did. Having lived in Boston, I can attest to the fact that old homes usually have relatively uneven, even pliable floors, and they think this is the reason that the sphere would roll and change direction, because these floors were incredibly uneven. Also, hey, if this so-called oddball was so willing to roll, why didn't it just roll off the windowsill that it sat on before Terry started playing guitar and this whole saga started? This doesn't entirely explain why the ball rolled on its own when in the possession of the Navy, but hey, I'm just the messenger, don't shoot me. Additionally, this wasn't way back in the past. This was in 1974, 19 years before the X-Files would have aired, so you can't tell me folks weren't already thinking about UFOs with frequency at that point. Anyways, if you can't tell, I'm not entirely sold on this sphere being an extraterrestrial. As I often say to my skeptical family members, we shouldn't have to look at our feet for aliens when above our heads is the entire freaking cosmos. I'm not saying I don't believe in alien life, I absolutely do, but I'm not convinced by episodes like this. So remember in my West Virginia video when it turned out that there was a secret bunker underneath the Greenbrier Hotel? Well, if you're more into Florida, I have good news for you. There's also a bunker, a secret one in fact, in Florida. This bunker sits outside of Mount Dora, Florida, a small town north of Orlando that's home to about 16,000 people. Mount Dora was founded back in the late 1800s with its name not necessarily reflecting any mountain of grand size. I mean, come on, we are in Florida after all. Rather, it reflects that the city is on a plateau just 184 feet above sea level. Early in this town's life, it would be somewhat popular for outdoor recreation, hunting, fishing, and boating, and it would eventually gain employers such as a fertilizer factory and an orange packing house following the railroad coming to town. After this, it would become more residential. Anyways, Mount Dora's bunker, so-called the Mount Dora Catacombs, dwells right underneath an orange grove outside of the city. The motivation for building these catacombs was the looming fear of nuclear war through the Cold War, and also, funny enough, a Pat Frank novel, Alas Babylon, which details a fictional post-nuclear apocalypse that actually, funny enough, takes place in a town based on Mount Dora, Florida. This prompted members of 25 affluent families in the Mount Dora area to bring their resources together and construct this massive below-ground bunker. This bunker is, really large. It's 5,000 square feet just in living space. There are also storage areas where food and fuel were stored, enough to keep about 100 people alive for 6 months, and they had a recreation room, a clinic, a kitchen, bathrooms with sewage systems, and even air conditioning and filtering. Also, I suppose just in case, they had 10,000 rounds of ammo and droves of boomsticks. Their thought was they'd pull the old White Spring bunker move and wait out the nuclear firestorm, only to pop their heads back up after the worst had passed, and carry on the torch rebuilding what the Soviets took from them. I suppose under the assumption that the Americans had ultimately won the war. Anyways, the Mount Dora catacombs are basically an underground hotel. But, well, as we should be aware, none of this nuclear obliteration stuff ever did come to pass, and ultimately these catacombs would be sealed up. Sadly, my impression is that these bunkers are in really poor shape. I mean, think about what would happen in a subterranean environment when you shut off a dehumidifier in Florida for 40 years. You get the picture. That being said, there are a few photos of them in semi-modern day, and I can even tell you right where this bunker is. To start, these photos were taken by writer Bill Sievert and photographer Richard Sladen, who in 2006 were allowed to enter the catacombs for an article. Therefore, I can't really share these photos beyond what I would consider fair use. That being said, here are a couple of snippets. To start, here's an old diagram of the layout of the catacombs. As you can see, rooms were abundant. It's honestly a big place. Also, in classic Fallout fashion, there are cockroaches, all over the place, especially where there were canned goods. The place is honestly just totally screwed and covered in black mold. I hope the reporters that went down there wore really high quality masks. Here's a photo, however, of a family in the catacombs back in the day when it wasn't a moldy mess. Anyways, if you want to see more of this, there are photos shared across the internet, but I can't in good faith use too many not Creative Commons photos. Sorry. Now, as for where this bunker is, I actually searched for a little while and didn't have any luck, but then I came upon a Reddit post detailing where this is. So again, this is private property, do not under any circumstances visit this spot, and certainly don't go inside. But in short, this Redditor managed to dig up the land sale deed for the land used for the catacombs, which was a 1954 transaction. And this deed's lease had 8 coordinates for the land that makes up the bunker. In short, I'm not going to give you the coordinates per se, but what I will say is that this bunker apparently sits right underneath an orange field on the west side of Lake Gertrude. In short, there's a dang fallout shelter under this orange field, and while now it's probably inhospitable to people, it was once a massive complex where some rich decided they'd escape the apocalypse together. I don't urge you to check it out, but it's certainly a weird bit of lore. Cassadaga, while to my redneck brain sounds a little bit like Talladega, is actually a word that elicits a much more elegant scene, and in its native Seneca tongue, it means water beneath the rocks. Cassadaga, Florida, lies on the eastern coast of Florida, about 30 miles north of Orlando, and it has a peculiar reputation for hosting more people with supposed special abilities than anywhere else in the country. Now, this story about Cassadaga begins in Pike, New York in 1848, with a young boy named George Colby being born. This young boy would supposedly live a relatively normal life until about 1860 when he was dipped into a frozen Minnesota lake and subsequently apparently gained the ability to speak with spirits, something that his Baptist household apparently adamantly disapproved of. I cannot imagine the whooping poor George must have gotten when he told his parents, "Hey guys, I think I can talk to the dead." Whack whack, you didn't hear anything, kid. Anyways, now George would supposedly hone this ability, giving readings and seances throughout the USA, and gaining a reputation as the so-called seer of spiritualism. Ultimately, he would attend a spiritualist camp meeting in Lilydale, New York, a place suspiciously close to one Cassadaga, New York, which is probably a thing worth mentioning. And then one fateful day in Lake Mills, Iowa, a so-called spirit guide of his, a Native American named Seneca, he said, would instruct him to travel southward to Florida to a place called Seneca, referred to as Blue Springs Landing. He would follow this advice, and so it's said by Colby, when he arrived here in 1875, it was the exact same place that was shown to him in a vision. It's said that here Colby would venture into the West Volusia woods and found the community that would be Cassadaga, building a home here and being joined by fellow spiritualists. Nearly 20 years later, in December of 1894, here he founded the Southern Cassadaga Spiritualist Camp Meeting Association. Today, strangely enough, this community persists, playing host to the Cassadaga Hotel, an auditorium, a temple devoted to George Colby, a library, a healing center, a bookstore, and an educational building where performances are held. Many of these buildings were built in the 1800s or rebuilt in the early 1900s to replace aging structures. Additionally, 33 of the town's 55 homes are from at the latest the early 1900s, making this community a real treat if you're like me and you like seeing old stuff. Now let's get into what makes this place weird in modern day. Many of the modern day residents that call Cassadaga home are also linked to Cassadaga's occult past, being mediums and healers that operate kind of wooey businesses from their households, with even more believing in the basic tenets of spiritualism, holding that a person's soul or whatnot lives on beyond the end of their physical body, and believing that it is not just faith but a scientific fact that mediums can communicate with the dead and spirits. This system of beliefs, according to them, is simultaneously a science, religion, and philosophy. Weirdly, this was news to me, this belief also interacts with Christianity, as they do regard God and Jesus as holy figures, and they adhere to the Bible, although they don't believe the story of the devil's fall from grace for whatever reason. Today, not necessarily all of Cassadaga, but the 57-acre area that is the Southern Cassadaga Spiritualist Camp Meeting Association is a U.S. historic district, and the camp is a federal tax-exempt church that's run by a board of trustees. And of course, as I said in the introduction, it has the reputation for hosting more people that are self-proclaimed psychics than anywhere else in the country, and therefore gets the title of being the psychic capital of America. So on a bridge somewhere in Florida, there is a tree growing. But to start this conversation about the so-called Fred the Tree, we've first got to cover 7 Mile Bridge. Just bear with me through a bit of history here. I promise, the ending is pretty fun. The history of this bridge that the tree dwells on, that connects the US mainland to the Florida Keys, that in modern day we sort of take for granted, dates back to the early 1900s, when the Keys were basically completely isolated from the continental United States. This all changed, however, when one Henry M. Flagler connected the Keys to the mainland with an extension of the Florida East Coast Railway that was referred to as the Overseas Railroad. This was a monumental project and extended 128 miles down to Key West, becoming fully operational in 1912. The motivation for the construction of this railroad was economic, of course, though the cargo shipping industry through the Keys, which the railroad hoped it could benefit from, didn't live up to what they anticipated. Regardless, the railroad served some business purposes and transported people on a slow-moving train ride that would get them between Key West and Miami in 4 or 5 hours, about the same amount of time it takes to do the drive in modern day. Ultimately, this railroad would serve the region until it was damaged by the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, which ripped through Florida and the Keys, and due to the less than optimal revenue the railway was generating, it would have been fiscally irresponsible to restore the railway. Thus, they sold the rail line to the state government of Florida, which rather than rebuilding the railway, used the infrastructure to extend the existing US Route 1 further south, building what is today the famous Overseas Highway and closely following the railroad's original path. It was during this construction that 7 Mile Bridge, a bridge in the Florida Keys that connects Knights Key, which is part of Marathon, Florida, with Little Duck Key in the lower Keys, was built. It's worth noting, parallel with 7 Mile Bridge, is some of the old rail line that was constructed under Flagler's direction. This old bridge that runs next to the modern 7 Mile Bridge was known as the Knights Key, Pigeon Key, Moser Channel, Passett Channel Bridge. It's kind of a mouthful, I know. Anyways, here's where we get weird. There's a portion of these old rail lines that is only accessible by boat or helicopter. That's around mile marker 41 or 42, and it just so happens that inside of this old rail line, because its trusses were built with sand, One day, when a bird took a little dookie onto the tracks, a seed happened to survive in those bird droppings, and that seed took root, digging its little roots into the sands, in the trusses, and beginning to grow. This tree, colloquially referred to as Fred the tree, is the result. Fred, you see, is an Australian pine tree, sometimes called a salt-sprayed casuarina, and as you drive down 7 Mile Bridge, you can observe this little tree literally growing out of a railroad track. Now, to the people of the Florida Keys, Fred is a symbol of hope and resilience, a sign that these people love their home, and their home is resilient enough to withstand the many extreme weather events that hit this small island community. He's also kind of a famous landmark if you can't tell. There's a group of volunteers referred to as Fred's Elves, and every year they dress up Fred for Christmas. He gets lights and a solar-powered menorah even. And this tree was even in the recent Jake Gyllenhaal movie Roadhouse. And funny enough, you might be worried Fred is fleeting, that he won't survive much longer. But it seems in actuality this forest on the railroad tracks of the Keys might just be getting started. See, another small tree, a little brother for Fred, is starting to sprout up right next to him. Is he a vigilante, a local, a student? Is he even human? Locals, of course, know what I'm talking about. The University of Central Florida's so-called Rat Man, a full-grown man that is from time to time seen walking around the University of Central Florida's campus in a rat costume. This creature, or cryptid, or perhaps man with superpowers, has a rat costume equipped with a tail, a rat-shaped face mask, and is often sighted near trash cans like a real rat. Wowzers. Heck, even UCF's police know of the fabled Rat Man, and on Twitter, back when it was Twitter, acknowledged him as their crime-fighting partner, even asking if he could help them find who was spraying graffiti on campus. Apparently, some officers even gave this Rat Man an informal certificate of appreciation. Anyways, Rat Man supposedly has been known to fight crime on campus, and you can find videos of him on YouTube walking the streets of campus with a tail that I assume is his primary weapon to whip his foes. Beyond this, for defense, he has a utility belt, which I can only assume holds his ratarangs, glowing red eyes, and he even has a gas mask. In short, Rat Man looks ready for anything, and the power scaling community had better be ready because I'm pretty sure he can take on Goku and Saitama at the same time. Now, I know I'm talking this superhero up a lot, and I hate to burst your bubble, but it appears that Rat Man might not actually be a real vigilante roaming the campus of UCF like some say, but rather is a pet project of a local filmmaker that sort of grew out of its own britches and became an urban legend on the campus of UCF. The filmmaker that invented Rat Man was Cameron Cruz, who published a mockumentary of sorts for a film class he was taking at UCF, making him into a real-life sort of superhero who would do everything from stop bike thieves to go on patrol, hunkering down near trash cans and running away when spotted at unimaginable speeds. As part of this film, he even put up posters of the Rat Man around campus, and the Rat Man started to blow up a bit on social media. Students, because of this, started forming rat hunts to unmask the Rat Man, and there were even people claiming to be the Rat Man, one even saying that he was the Rat Man on Reddit and would unmask himself in front of the student union, leading to crowds of students and police officers, for whatever reason, to show up there, though sadly the post was fake, of course. This is actually the event where police brought the informal certificate of appreciation for Rat Man, playing into the absurd Rat Man joke. Anyways, ultimately a proper documentary was made called Have You Seen the Rat Man by one James Barry, detailing the whole phenomenon. I'll link it in the description. Watch it if you can, it's good fun. Anyways, Rat Man is not a real vigilante on UCF's campus, but he has kind of become a bit of UCF folklore. Now it's only fitting that we bounce from one underground thing to another, though this underground thing is not a bunker and it's rather a horse. Now before we get into this horse named Big Bob, let's cast ourselves back in time a little bit and remember, cars didn't always take us everywhere. Horses, you see, used to draw wagons, plow fields, and even shepherd the dead to their final resting place. This in particular was the job of Big Bob. Big Bob was a so-called cemetery horse who was born in 1877 and worked in Sanford, Florida. It's said that for 28 years, this was Bob's job, where he would shepherd the dead to their final resting place in Lakeview Cemetery. FYI, Lakeview Cemetery is now multiple cemeteries in the Sanford Municipal Cemetery Complex. That being said, I'm pretty sure it's still just labeled Lakeview Cemetery. Anyways, Bob was employed back in the day by the T.J. Miller's funeral home. Bob, it's said, was a large white horse, and it's said that he was so good at his job that he knew how to get to the cemetery without even a driver. He took his job seriously. People loved this horse, and it's said he had a kind disposition, and locals would give him apples when he wasn't busy pulling around bodies. Now in 1913, Big Bob would be put out to pasture, retiring so to speak. But sadly, as many of us do, he would pass away just a year into his retirement, and while this is sad, this is also where the fun and weird part of this story comes into play. See, my impression is that horses are usually buried on the farms they work at, or on the property of their owners. But this horse, given he shepherded us to our graves for decades, was paid the respect of being buried alongside us. He was buried in the cemetery he so regularly attended, Lakeview Cemetery, where he would forever rest alongside human neighbors, many of which he transported there. It seems the community around Sanford takes great pride in this horse, and at one point, some monster even decided to vandalize Big Bob's headstone, but a local monument company replaced it with the original being put on display and cleaned up in the Sanford Museum. Today, you can still visit Big Bob's grave in Lakeview Cemetery. It's just off 46A in Sanford. Also, I must tell you, while you may bring your loved one some flowers to their grave, there's a slight different tradition for Big Bob. It's said that rather than stopping by the flower shop, you should stop by the grocery store and pick him up a nice juicy apple to leave by his grave. The Neptune Memorial Reef is maybe a little bit tame for a weird video, but it is certainly unique, and I'd be ashamed if I didn't include at least one below water weird thing on a list in the only state where I've personally gone scuba diving. Anyways, this reef is certainly not natural. It's a man-made reef, in actuality the largest ever made. This reef is 40 feet below the surface of the ocean and is meant to be an artistic representation of the lost city of Atlantis. Also, FYI, they didn't just plop this faux Atlantis down there and call it a day. It was a heck of an ordeal. Placing it required passing regulations, for instance, proving a strong storm wouldn't destroy it. But the effort they put into making this reef was robust and worth it, as agencies ranging from the US EPA to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission have approved of this reef's construction. Here, not only can you have you or a loved one's remains cremated and deposited into this home for modern marine life, in other words, it's a mausoleum, but if you were to scuba dive and see this unique site, you'd find that it has become home to over 100 coral colonies, and a diverse array of marine life, including, strangely enough, a sea urchin species that was thought to have been extinct. Beyond this, there's everything from lobsters to moray eels dwelling down there. Anyways, these days, the reef is not just a recreation destination for scuba and snorkel enthusiasts, but also everyone from scientists to those wishing to wish their buried loved ones well. You're even welcome to hop on a boat and pay this site a visit yourself if you so choose, but pay heed, you cannot fish here. Anyways, let me know if you've been to this spot. It seems pretty swell and pretty unique. Alright, buckle up because I've got a small town cryptid tale for you that's equal parts bizarre and oddly heartwarming. Bardin, Florida, a teeny tiny town with a population of just about 400 people, where everyone knows everyone, and the most exciting thing on any given day is probably a good gossip session at the local store. But oh, there's one thing that keeps it from being just another sleepy spot on the map. This little town has its very own Sasquatch-like creature, the Bardin Booger. Now, before you start thinking about something straight out of a booger-filled nose, let me stop you. The booger here is not your average nasal annoyance, it's named after the boogeyman, that classic figure who haunted our childhood nightmares. So yes, it's a cryptid and it's been hanging around Bardin, Florida at least since the 1940s. Now, the famous Patterson-Gimlin film featuring Bigfoot came out in 1967, but the Bardin Booger, it's been making appearances in this little corner of Florida long before that, starting in the 1940s. One of the first sightings came from a woman riding her horse through the woods, who swore she saw a tall man in a raincoat. But it wasn't a raincoat. It was a creature, part man, part gorilla, covered in hair like a walking carpet. And that's how the Bardin Booger first entered the local folklore. But this creature isn't the kind of cryptid that inspires big dramatic hunts, like the one for that infamous python in Peninsula, Ohio. Instead, it's more of a series of small quirky encounters that have been built up over time. Take the 1981 story from Weekly World News, for example. A local guy named BJ Glisson claimed to see the Bardin Booger in a pond making strange mumbling noises. But get this, the creature had no legs, none, just a weird, legless thing splashing around mumbling to itself. Also, it's worth noting, I find this tale sort of interesting because Midwest Bigfoot is usually seen around water, as is the booger. Make of that what you will. Anyways, the stories don't always line up perfectly. Sometimes the booger is described more like a wild man, a caveman vibe with old clothing and a lantern. Yes, I said a lantern. Who else do you know that carries a lantern around the woods? And also an American flag. Yes, that's also part of the booger's wardrobe, apparently. There's even a story from the Azalea Festival in Palatka, where the booger reportedly showed up waving a flag. And as if that wasn't strange enough, some folks also say it has a skunk ape-like quality, like an overpowering smell that can literally knock you off your feet or disorient you if you're trying to shoot the booger, which occurred in one story. Now, about that lantern too, I have to say, it's a little weird. I've heard of all kinds of cryptids, but I've never heard of one that likes to stroll around with a light in hand. Some locals believe the booger isn't holding a regular lantern, but it's rather harnessing some otherworldly power that makes glowing balls of light, which, okay, that's a fun twist, I guess. It definitely fits with the Bigfoot isn't just an animal group of people. Regardless, despite all of these oddities, the locals seem to love their booger. In fact, Bud's Grocery in town sells booger-themed merchandise. Think t-shirts and hats with the booger's face on them. Some people even wear booger costumes to local events, and there are booger songs that the town jams to. In short, they've basically turned their local cryptid into a mascot, one that's part of their community's charm. Now, it's worth noting the booger hasn't been spotted much in recent years. Some think he's either passed away from old age or he's just taken a break or something else, but regardless, the legend lives on. And Bardin seems pretty content with that. Now, if you're wondering what the booger actually is, people have their own theories. Some say it's just a Florida black bear because, hey, they're known to stand on two legs and they've got a bit of fur, and also they're known to migrate through Bardin. Others lean towards swamp gas, which I don't know about you. I've seen a lot of swamp gas ignite, and it's never looked like Bigfoot to me, though maybe that explains the lantern part. The most reasonable explanation in my book, maybe the booger was just some local hermit, a hairy guy who liked to live off the land and carried around a lantern. Throw in a little bit of hair and you've got yourself a cryptid story. At the end of the day, regardless, whether the booger is real or fake or just a fun tale, it's clear that the folks in Bardin have embraced him. They've turned their local mystery into a source of pride, something that brings the community together. So here's to the Bardin Booger, a lovable and maybe slightly creepy figure who's become part of the town's quirky identity. 10 out of 10. I would visit just to see if I can catch a glimpse of the booger myself. Florida, you are weirder than I anticipated, but I mean that in the best of ways. Anyways, channel news. I recognize I promised Indiana's ghost stories, and that video is indeed coming. However, those take a while to edit, and life got in the way, so for now we're running with Florida instead. That means, hopefully, Indiana's ghost stories are coming up next. After that, man, I think we owe another part 2 to some states, and I think I'm diving into some cold cases, if that's your jazz. I'm not talking about well-known cold cases either, I'm talking about stuff you've hopefully never heard of before. Also, while Amazing Places Part 1 did pretty poorly, I plan to give that series another go, and I think I owe it to North Carolina given the great reception their state offered me. Regardless, thank y'all for watching, and whether you just found a little ball that likes to roll around on its own in the woods, or saw Bigfoot in your backyard swinging around a lantern, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.